Hi. When I was a small child, maybe 9 or 10 years old, I spent some time listening to my dad's comedy albums on the record player. For those of you old enough to know what a record player is. And among his comedy records was a really popular one by a then young black comedian whose name has become equivalent to Voldemort and can't be said, but it sounds sort of like Bing Crosby, who was a very funny guy, and one of his pieces was my first introduction to the story of Noah building an ark, where he highlighted the absurdity of it by suggesting an image where Noah was in his driveway building this and his neighbors began to ask him what he was doing. And it helped me as a little kid to realize the absurdity of the story, but I had no place to put that because I knew nothing about the Bible and really nothing about my own tradition other than the Holocaust and Passover and a few little things like that. But now that I'm working on this series, that has come back to me, because as we move into this passage today, starting in Genesis 6:14, and we hear God say to Noah, "Make yourself an ark of cypress wood," etc., perhaps we can hear, along with that comedian from 60 years ago, the absurdity of what God is putting on this man Noah, who we saw last time is righteous in his generation and is innocent and is the best that God could do. But could anything be expecting this assignment, which Noah does with no comment at all? So I just want to start with that, recognizing the absurdity of what's being said here in this very familiar story. On the right side of the screen, you can see what we're going to be following throughout this, the traditional separation of this into the J version and the P version. And if you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to look back a couple of videos to the introduction of this section where I go over some of that. As you can see, though, today we're on the P version, and the first section of the P version you can see is 9 to 22. We're starting at 14 and going to 22. And if you can just look at that section on the screen there, you can see its description of God telling Noah how to make the ark. And then at the bottom of that paragraph, you can see Noah did this. He did all that commanded him. But on the left side of that chart, on the J version, you can see what follows after this, the beginning of chapter 7, 1 to 5, is something very similar. Then Yahweh, in this case, said to Noah, "Go into the ark and bring with you 7 pairs of clean animals," etc. And then at the end it says, "And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him." So are we going to read that as first he was told to bring in the pairs of all animals, and then later he was told to bring in 7 pairs of clean animals, or what? Well, we'll get to that when we get to it next video, when we look at chapter 7. But I just want to draw attention to that right now for those not familiar with this question of the structure and the two versions of the story, so you can be aware that today we're dealing with the P version. Almost all scholars would agree this P version is from the time of Babylonian exile. The J version, or as scholars tend to call it now, non-P, may well be from that same time period, but we'll get to the J version next time. We also looked a little bit last time at the story structure options. So 2 kinds of chiasm. This one here, according to Wenham, and as you can see, his A section is not exactly the same as the section we're going to look at today. He starts with the B section in 622, that in his version parallels 8:18 to 19 on the other side. And then the chiasm that I've constructed with the help of other authors still also doesn't exactly have that. It's 13 to 22, because that's when God starts speaking to Noah. And then in Kasuto's 2 sets of 6 paragraph version, it's also 13 to 22. So 13, if you didn't watch the last video, is God beginning to tell Noah that he's determined to make an end of all flesh because of the violence, and he's going to destroy them. But the ark connection with that isn't made immediately, and we'll see how that plays out in our story. But before we get there, I did something that I hope you'll find interesting, which is I began to explore how this story is seen in pop culture. Because although I heard it first as part of a comedy album, many kids hear it as part of a game or a toy or a puzzle or a song. And Noah's Ark is one of the most popular biblical themes in all of pop culture. And I just wanted to give us some examples of how widely it's spread out, so we can be aware of that as we try to listen to what the original authors are trying to say in this story. So first in music, a lot of serious music from Claude Cézanne in 1875, and then others including Benjamin Britten in 1958, and then finally Stravinsky in a TV musical, one of his last things did, called The Flood. And if you haven't heard that, it's very Stravinsky. And then, of course, the great Shel Silverstein with his kids' song, The Unicorn, about why there are no unicorns, why the unicorn got left off the ark. Also some theater things, including Danny Kaye and Richard Rodgers' musical 2x2, and then one for kids by Flanders Captain Noah and His Floating Zoo in the 1970. And one thing I want you to see here is how playful so many of these pictures are, as if there's just a fun exercise with kids and animals. Although there are no kids named on the ark, it's amazing how many these pictures show children there. In film and television, way back to the very beginning of film, you see 1928, a silent film, for which I couldn't find a poster, and one of a couple of Disney films very early on, 1933, just when Mickey Mouse was first starting. This is 6 years before Fantasia. Disney had Father's Noah's Ark. Skipping a few decades, one of the great spectacle films by Dino De Laurentiis, a filmmaker known for spectacle with many stars. It's called The Bible, but it's really just the first part of Genesis. It was the fourth best grossing film of 1966, and this is at a time, of course, when the Beatles were popular and all kinds of things. A movie about the Bible and this story were popular. Then some others, including a Yogi Bear version, and then one trying to discover the quote-unquote truth behind it, to see the discovery, which is really popular in the 60s and 70s, to see if you could find the remnants of it at Mount Ararat. One from Portuguese, another one that's trying to tell us, the true story behind this. The second Disney version in 1998, starring Tony Danza as a father who's got 40 days to build a floating zoo. I haven't seen that one. Maybe you have. Another one in 1999, the French Raining Cats and Dogs in 2003, and again you see the fun-looking animals there. This one from 2007, also with lots of fun animals, and amazing how many of Noah looks a lot like Santa Claus with a big beard, even though he's not described that way in Genesis. Evan Almighty, the sequel to the very popular Bruce Almighty, starring Steve Carell there and Morgan Freeman as God, and who could argue with Morgan Freeman as God? And then one I've referred to a couple times, the Darren Aronofsky, much less child version of Noah with Russell Crowe, and we'll come back to that one a number of times. And that wasn't the last one. BBC One had one in 2015. And then there are more, as you can see, a couple more. In fiction, it also goes back to, notice, almost the exact same time period as the first silent movies. One of the last things that H.G. Wells did was All Aboard for Ararat, his science sci-fi version of it. And then Rosemary Harris's The Moon and the Clouds, and a few others here. Then the Noah's Ark water park, billed as the biggest water park in the world, as if all the Noah's Ark was about having fun in the water. And it couldn't be complete without the super 3D Noah's Ark Nintendo game in 2015. Games and toys could have gone on forever. If you go to your favorite search engine and do Noah's Ark games and toys, it'll fill your screen and won't stop scrolling, because there are hundreds and almost thousands of them like this. And you see the familiarity with the little fun animals and the kids. And I love that Fisher-Price one with that kid having so much fun putting it together. You can do it in crossword puzzle form. I didn't bring up the 1,000-piece crossword puzzle of it. You can build your own Noah's Ark wood project with your kids. There are also a number of nonprofits that take this title to become animal sanctuaries or child centers, as you can see again with the fun animal things. You'd never know that anybody died or drowned. What a horrible story it was. In books, I brought up this one separate from kids' books because it's a book on architecture, seriously getting into the question of designing Noah's Ark and what the Bible's telling us about the role of architecture, and especially what this author, Damisch, calls disaster architecture. It was actually a surprisingly interesting essay. And then finally here, among kids' books, Sassy and Chapman's Goodnight Ark, which has a nice little blurb about helping your children settle into bed as the rain comes and the animals settle in. As if the Noah's Ark story was simply a big bedtime story, but it's not, is it? So let's go back, and I'm going to bring up the flood and Gilgamesh comparisons here as we go into these first couple of verses, starting at verse 14, so we can see something in detail that I was looking at last time, 2 times ago in the overview, which is how the authors, whether the P or J, or call that one non-P if you like, were building upon one of 3 possible Mesopotamian back sources. In this case, I've highlighted the Gilgamesh Tablet 11, which is the most recent one and has a number of these parallels that we can hear with the language that we hear in Genesis 6:14. So let's jump right in here. So God says to Noah, "Make yourself an ark of cypress wood." Notice already it's suggesting that Noah knows what this is. The word for ark here, teva, is an Egyptian loan word, so although Noah speaks Hebrew, or at least understands Hebrew, he will speak Hebrew after the flood is over when he's talking to his sons. So the presumption is everybody here speaks Hebrew, but this is an Egyptian loan word meaning box or chest. And as Westermann notes, the irony here that in the Gilgamesh tablet, the huge box which is shaped like a cube is called a ship in Akkadian, while in Genesis 6, the ark, which is much more like a ship, is described as a chest. The only other teva in the Bible is the one that Moses' mother puts him in and is found by Pharaoh's daughter in Exodus. So as Casuto notes in my note down below, here it is humanity that is to be saved, there it is the chosen people. In my view, the Exodus story almost certainly was written first, so in this case, the Genesis authors are having Noah build an ark that's similar to the one that saved Moses that they would already know about. But Moses, the character, obviously doesn't know about Moses. Noah, the character, doesn't know anything about Moses or the Exodus, because that's obviously much later in the story world. So this comes as if he knows what it is, and if he doesn't, at least a description is made. The translation here has cypress wood, but it's literally gopher, and a very specific type of wood, which is only mentioned here in the Hebrew Bible, so it's hard to know what kind of wood that might be. It continues to say make rooms, but the Hebrew kanim here literally means nests. It's similar to the word kanim for reeds or rushes, but of course he wouldn't be making reeds or rushes here. He'd be making rooms, or as Casuto suggests down below, or quoting down below, from the Midrash, compartments and dwellings. So the idea that of course putting animals in their separate spaces. And then to cover it inside and out with pitch here. And the word for pitch here, kover, that's the one that you can see on the right side of the screen, number 5, is very similar to the Akkadian kupru, one of those things that leads scholars to really see the connections between the Mesopotamian text and the Genesis text. So these rooms are to be covered, basically waterproofed, inside and out with pitch. And this is how you are to make it. And of course, this is where most people hear about cubits and don't know what a cubit is. Here's what a cubit looks like. It's roughly the length from a fingertip to an elbow. And of course, that's not a standard length because everybody's arm is a different length, but it has the benefit of being handy. You can't lose it unless you lose your arms. So here it is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. That's not that high when you think about it, and I can't find any particular mathematical puzzle that is solved by looking at this relationship of 300 to 50 to 30, although many numbers like that in the Bible are, like the dimensions of New Jerusalem and the end of the Bible in Revelation, which does have symbolic numbers, symbolic meaning, but I couldn't find one here, so if you come up with one, you can post it on the comments if you like. So he's described to make it this size, and as I showed last time, and one of those images from the Ark Encounter, the Noah's Ark Museum, where they try to compare it to the size of a space shuttle or submarine. This is huge. 300 cubits, if you picture a cubit as roughly half a yard, something like that. This is longer than a football field, or even longer than that. And how Noah is supposed to build that, how he's supposed to mill all that wood, and what he's supposed to put it together to, where he's supposed to find nails or something to hold it together with, isn't named here. He's just supposed to do it. But it's not just a regular boat, it's got a roof here at Sohar. That's the only time that this word is used in the entire Hebrew scripture, so it could be understood as a roof, a window, or a skylight. And I provided a series of some translations here so you can see how whether it's the roof or the door or the decks, the three words there at issue, can be translated different ways. So you can see that the word here, Sohar, that's translated as roof could be an opening for daylight or a window. Then the one for the door here, Pitak, can also be translated, usually that one is as a door. I take that back. That's easily a door. But the one for decks here, Tzad, is only here in Genesis. In some places it's deck, some places it's rooms, some places it's stories. Deck is sort of like a story, except of course a deck is open and a story would be closed. It says a roof for the ark, so it doesn't make clear. But all pictures we've ever seen, there are no open decks. So despite the translation, I think of it as more as closed-in stories. So in 3 verses, God tells Noah what to do. It's not much of a description. A normal IKEA bookcase has longer instructions than that, but out of that, Noah is expected to bring this thing into being. And only now is Noah told by God what for. And so we see starting in verse 17 here, God's response is, "For my part, I am going to bring a flood of water." I note here that it's stated strongly in the Hebrew, "Vani hine," and I behold. This is the third use of hine in these verses 12 to 17. We've seen a number of times that for whatever reasons translators leave that out, but it's a pay attention word that the authors are using here many times to highlight what I'm trying to highlight, which is the shocking nature of what God's asking Noah to do here. This is hardly a matter-of-fact assignment. So for my part, behold, I'm going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to ruin it or to destroy it. The word for flood, mabul here, or hamubel in the flood. Notice in the Septuagint, it's the Greek kataklysmos, from which, of course, the English cataclysm. So cataclysm, literally a flood of water here. Notice it's a flood of waters, as if it could be a flood of something else. It could be a flood of lava, or a flood of something else that we haven't thought of here, but it's specified a flood of water. And I've noted that the word for destroy here, sheketh, was used several times in the previous verses, translated often as corrupt, but it's the same word here. So that's why I've tried to use ruin as a parallel. So as the people have ruined the earth, God is going to ruin all flesh, in which is the breath of life. From under heaven makes it too much like a later Christian reading of that. Shemayim always in the Hebrew Bible simply means the sky. It's from the first verses of Genesis 1 forward. So from under the sky, all flesh, which is in which is the breath of life. So that would exclude fish, right? Who don't breathe the breath of life, at least not that kind of, not air breath. And the fish obviously aren't going to be affected by a flood, are they? Everything that is on the earth shall die, and it's a very unusual word here, yigva, which is not the normal word for dying at all, and we've seen other words for dying. I won't bring those all up now, but you can go back and see that. You note that for a literal definition means to pine away or to languish. It literally does not mean to die, but sort of to waste away, and it's only used by the priestly author in the Pentateuch. Otherwise, it's only in poetry, suggesting the sort of thing as poetic languishing is, as when life is difficult. One is as if one is dying without necessarily literally dying. So God will bring that flood, but that's not the end. Here's the good news of hope, so it's not just all destruction. I will establish my covenant with you. And this is very unusual because otherwise covenants are cut. The Hebrew verb there used to cut a covenant, suggesting something like cutting a scroll into a unit. So it's established signature block or a set of terms for somebody, like a treaty. But there's no paper involved here, and it's not two-way. It's even though it said with you, Noah is not asked to do anything. There are no conditions, unlike the covenant with Abraham in chapter 17, where in exchange for God's promises, Abraham is to circumcise himself and all the males in his household. Noah is not asked to do anything here. It's just a unilateral promise by God that there'll be some kind of future. Although it doesn't say yet what that future is, simply I will establish my covenant, berit here, the first of 284 times in the Masoretic text. And that expression of covenant here is one of the reasons why, as we saw last time, Hebert sees the Noah story as the hinge rather than end of chapter 11 and the coming of Abram and Sarai as the hinge in the book of Genesis. That there's the first part of creation, it's destroyed here, it's recreated with a new covenant. And we'll see some of the terms of that in chapter 9 when we finish this section. So, in patriarchal order, God tells them to come in this way. You shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. So the men and then the women. Notice how similar that is to what Lot is going to be told in the Sodom story, where Lot and his wife and his daughters husbands are to be brought out, but the daughters and their husbands will not be brought out, which will lead the daughters to get their father pregnant in a cave 2 consecutive nights. I'm sorry, to get pregnant by their father, not to get their father pregnant, of course. So there we'll see a number of parallels with the Sodom and Gomorrah story and the flood story. And of course, some of the echo there is in the classic James Baldwin quote, the fire next time, when God promises at the end of the story, never again will I destroy by water the fire next time. Whether that's the Sodom story or the end of the world story that we hear in Revelation or otherwise, we can determine in another context. So they're all to come into this ark and to be saved, just this one handful of people. Of course, it raises all kinds of problems for genetics as we would see it, for procreation within a family, but the text isn't concerned about that. When we get to the Tower of Nations, Table of Nations in chapter 10, we'll see how the authors show that spreading out and dividing. So, not only them, but every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. The male and female, of course, echoing 127, the image of God as male and female, and then the Toledot, the generations of Adam in 5:2 as all humans as male and female. So again, as I noted back in chapter 1, male and female is not the same as man and woman. Man and woman is a set of terms that apply specifically to gendered humans, whereas male and female clearly applies not only to animals here, but to non-living things, as we know, whether it's electrical outlets or plumbing parts, etc. So here, of each kind that's necessary to keep them alive. One could ask, of all living things here, it's distinct from all living things with the breath of life in them, but no fish in the ark. And we see the description, in case that was not clear enough in 19, the generic every living thing, they're specified here in verse 20. Of the birds according to their kinds, of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping things of the ground according to its kind, two of every kind shall come into you to keep them alive. Let's look a little closer at that just for a moment. Of every kind, here's also recalling Genesis 1, and I don't have it up now, but on the overview video I showed all the ways that the flood story echoes words and images from Genesis 1 and 2. This is certainly one of those. And the sequence of animals, just like the creation of them at the beginning. So birds of every kind, animals here, this would be domesticated animals, bahima. And then what's described as creeping things, which might make people think of like snakes, but really remes is a word for all small animals. So that would include rodents and other things that are small on the ground, as opposed to big animals like cattle. Two of every kind shall come into you. And as Casuto notes, of their own accord, which God would arouse in them. So Noah does not have the task of going and rounding them up and putting tracking sensors on them like people do for the cougars in our area here in the Pacific Northwest, which would be hard to find. I've walked these mountains for many decades and never seen one, but Noah doesn't have the task of going and rounding them up. They are to come to him. And you see that image in some of the kids' games and others where you see the animals like walking up a ladder into the ark. Okay, so not only that, he's told to take the food. Good suggestion, God, that he should take food for all these animals. Didn't say to bring poop bags, and it's really hard not to make jokes about this, because as much as it's a serious story about death and destruction, and we're going to focus on that later, the absurd element of it is hard to resist, of all these animals being on this boat together for a full year without any opportunity to remove their waste, etc. But enough food is supposed to be taken to feed them all and the humans for the entire year. No suggestion the humans can eat some of the animals that are on the boat. Here, the phrase for every kind of food, makal ma'akal, is generic, and so it's doesn't say what kind of food. If we saw at the beginning, the only kind of food that would be plant food. So the animals are vegetarian at this point, and store it up here or gather it together. It shall serve as food, which seems redundant. You take with you every kind of food that shall serve as food, but the words are different in Hebrew, so why the translators render it the same, it's hard to say. There's a word play on lechem, which is bread here, in the third person masculine plural of just the L particle, which is sort of the preposition there, but in this form of valahem, it's a play on bread. So it can serve as food or it can serve as bread for you and them. And then the last verse of our section here, which at one level can begin another scene, and we won't look at that in detail for now. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him, with no question. And as Westerman notes down below, this is not from him yet, other flood narratives have lively descriptions of carrying out all the commands. But as he says, quote, all of this is missing in P. Only one thing is important. Noah did what God commanded him. This sentence is pronounced with the greatest solemnity. It is like a musical pause. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. And the word for command here is in contrast with the words earlier, which is more of a request or just told here. This is echoing Genesis 1, though, the commands that God made over the earth. So now God is commanding a human, and the human is obedient. And again, whether that's a good thing or not, we'll have to consider as we go. So now the ark will be made, and the commands are issued, and in chapter 7 we'll see the J version of this, and we'll begin to look at whether we think of those are inconsistent in a way that we're hearing two different stories, or detailed in a way that it adds texture to the single story. See you then. Bye-bye.